Hello friends, welcome you all to another video, and today we are going to cover the term romanticism. As you can see on your screen, here you can read the summary of romanticism, that how at the end of the 18th century the romanticism began, and how it quickly spread throughout Europe and the United States to challenge the rational ideals or the classicism. So you know that the neoclassical period, which started from restoration from 1660, and it lasted until the French Revolution, or that is in 1789, or the death of Dr. Samuel Johnson in 1785. But actually, Romanticism began after the publication of the book Relic Ballads, which was jointly written by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge in 1798. And that is actually the beginning of Romantic period in English literature. Okay, so though the first 3 decades of the 19th century, with reference to American literature, the term neoclassic is rarely applied to 18th century or 8th century, but the American Romantic period actually starts from 1830 to 65. So that is the American literature for the Romantic period. And as I have told you in the last lecture also about the classicism, that historians, they have tried to define uh, classicism also and romanticism also. Okay, so the romanticism are either vague, or we can say that it is a meaningless definition or meaningless division from this to that. But actually, romanticism was started with the Elizabethan literature. We can say that new romanticism was there, and it was never died during the restoration or during the neoclassical period, because, or we can say, it was there and it started flourishing from 1744 with the Thompson's um, book, the seasons. This is the poem, a poetic book he has written, three seasons. And through it, I know that the Thomas Gray's poem, to the country churchyard, elegy written on the country churchyard. So that is also something like a transitional to the romanticism. So romanticism was there. Okay, and sometimes Dr. Johnson's age, or the later part of neoclassicism, is also called as a transition age. So actually romanticism was there. So whatever the historian were trying to do, that is the different things. Okay, so let's talk about some aspects of romanticism, or what is the features of romanticism in this lecture, because we are not going to deal with the history of romanticism or the poets or whatever the authors were there, but actually we are talking about the theory, because this paper is a literary criticism, and therefore I'm going to only talk about the aspects, nature, feature of romanticism, as we have done to the classicism. If you have never if you have not watched that video about the classicism, please go back and watch the video on classicism, then you understand the romanticism. So let's start with the first feature of romanticism, is that the preface to Rilke ballad is the manifesto of romanticism. Actually, the poetic book Rilke Ballads, there were only poetry, most poetry written by William Wordsworth, and few poems were written by S.T. Coleridge. But even though they don't have any preface, but because of the discussion, and the friends advise Wordsworth to add a preface, because the book is something different than the new classical poetry. It has a different kind of poetry, and new poetry were there, and therefore to explain the theory of those poetry, they emphasizes on him, they urged him to write down a preface, and he added a preface, and it was published in 1800, and therefore it became the Manifesto of Romanticism. So the prevailing attitude favor innovation over traditionalism, because classicism followed traditionalism, and innovation is the soul of romanticism. So innovation over traditionalism in materials, forms, and styles of literature, that is called as a romanticism. Wordsworth's preface to the second edition to Rilke Ballad, which was published in 1800, was written as a poetic manifesto or statement of revolutionary aims. in which he denounced the upper class subject, that the classism in the classical literature. The literature was only focused on upper class or rich class, elite class people. But in this manifesto, Wordsworth moved to the country people, poor people. Okay, so and the poetic diction of preceding century and proposed to deal with the materials from common life. So actually, the poetic diction means great words or so many variety of words. The language which was spoken by the rich elite class people should include in literature according to classical writers. But here, according to Wordsworth, that the subject matter should be chosen from the common humble people, the common life, and in selection of language really used by men, the common people who use the common language, that language should be the language of literature. That was the manifesto, or that was written in the preface to the ballad according to Wordsworth. So Wordsworth's serious or tragic treatment of lowly subjects in common language violated the neoclassical rule of decorum. So that was the rule of decorum by the neoclassic writers, which asserted that the serious genre should deal only with the momentous actions of royal and aristocratic characters in an appropriately elevated style. Other invention in the period where the exploitation of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, John Keats, and other of the realm of the supernatural end, because S.T. Coleridge and John Keats, they have dealt their writing, the poems with the supernaturalism. For example, S.T. Coleridge, the Kubla Khan is there, okay, Isabel is there. So these are the poems touched with the supernaturalism. And John Keats, the Eve of the Saint Agnes, this also deals with the supernaturalism. Okay, so the far away and the long ago, the assumption by William Blake is also there, William Wordsworth and Percy Bysshe Shelley, P.B. Shelley, of the person of poet prophet who writes in a visionary mode of poetry, and the use of poetic symbolism, especially for Blake and Shelley. Okay, deriving from a worldview in which objects are charged with a significance beyond their physical qualities. I always seek in what I see, as Shelley said, the likeness of something beyond the present and tangible object. So that was the first feature of Romanticism, that is the theory. Theorizing is there. Okay, they completely opposed the neoclassical theory, and therefore it became the poetic manifesto. The preface to lyrical ballad became the manifesto of romantic poetry. So let's move to the next feature of it, the definition of poetry. So that is another feature of romanticism. So in his preface to lyrical ballads, William Wordsworth have defined poetry, and again he also repeatedly declared that the good poetry is, he defined poetry as, the good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. The spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, and it was recollected into tranquility. That is the definition of poetry by William Wordsworth. So according to this view, poetry is not primarily a mirror of man in action, as John Dryden or the new classical people has said that it is just a imitation of human nature. Okay, so according to Wordsworth, according to the definition, it is not a mere the mirror of man in action. Okay, not mere, फक्त तेवढंच नाही, प्रतिबिंबच नाही फक्त, but it is, but contrarily, it is essential component in the poet's own feeling. The poet's own feeling also involved in it. While the process of composition, since it is spontaneous at end in the later part of his poetry, a definition of poetry, Wordsworth has said that is the opposite of artful manipulation of means to foreseen ends traced by the neoclassic critics. So Wordsworth carefully qualified this radical doctrine by describing his poetry as emotion recollected in tranquility, by specifying that a poet's spontaneity is the result of prior process of deep reflection, and by granting that it may be followed by second thoughts and revisions. But the immediate act of composition, if a poem is to be genuine, must be spontaneous, that is, in force and free of what Wordsworth decried as the artificial rules and convention of his neoclassical predecessor. If poetry comes not as naturally as the leaves to tree, Keats has wrote in his one of his letter, it had better not come at all. So he said that according to John Keats, if poetry is not coming as leaves come on the tree, then it is better that it should not come. Okay, so the naturally poetry should come according to John Keats. The philosophical minded Coleridge substituted for neoclassic rules, which he described as imposed on the poem form without the concept of inherent organic laws. That is, he convinced that each poetic work, like a growing plant, evolves according to its own internal principles into its final organic form. So that was the theorizing or the definition of poetry and the organic form of poetry. That was the second feature of romanticism. Let's move to the third feature of romanticism, that is the fura and fana, that is the natural things, whether it was in romanticism or it is something different. That is the third feature of the romanticism. To a remarkable degree, external nature, the landscape, together with its flora and fauna, became a precedent subject of poetry and was described with an accuracy and sensuous nuance unprecedented in earlier writers. It is mistake, however, to describe the romantic poets as simply nature poets. While many major poets by Wordsworth and Coleridge, and to great extent by Shelley and Keats, set out from to the return to an escape or change of aspect in the landscape, the outer scene is not presented for its own sake but as a stimulus for the poet to engage in the most characteristic human activity, that of thinking. Representative romantic works are in fact poems of feelingful meditation which, although often stimulated by a natural phenomenon, are concerned with the central human experiences and problems. Wordsworth asserted in what he called a prospectus to his major poem that it is the mind of man which is my hound and the main region of my song, that was written by William Wordsworth. So let's talk about the fourth feature of romanticism, that is the long and short poems. So neoclassical poetry was about other people, but many romantic poems, long and short, invited the reader to identify the protagonist with the poem themselves. So they were emotionally, it means that the hero of their poem was the poet itself. That is the feature of romanticism. Okay, so in Wordsworth period, the Wordsworth was the main hero of his poems, and number of relics or in alterer but recognized form, as in Lord Byron's Childe Harold, which was published in 1812 to 18 and period in 1805 and revised in 1850. In prose, we find a parallel vague in the revealing personal essays of Charles Lamb and William Hazlitt's, and in number of spiritual and intellectual autobiographies. Thomas de Quincey's Confession of an English Opium Eater, 1822, it was published. Coleridge's Biography Literaria in 1817, and Thomas Carlyle's fictionalized self-representation in Sartor Resartus in 1833 to 34. And whether romantic subjects were the poets themselves or other people, they were no longer represented as a part of an organized quest. Often they were also social non-conformists or outcasts. Many important romantic works had as protagonists the isolated rebel, whether for good or ill. Prometheus, Cain, the wandering Jew, the satanic hero villain, or the great outlaw. These were the features of it. And the last feature, the fifth feature, it about the French Revolution and the three important slogans from the French Revolution, that is the freedom, that is liberty, equality, and fraternity. These are the three important slogans which was given by the French Revolution, and the impact of French Revolution on the romantic period or romantic writers. So that is the fifth feature of romanticism, the last feature. So what seemed to be number of political liberals, the infinite social promise of the French Revolution in the early 17th and 19th fostered the sense in romantic writers, but there was a great age of new beginnings and high possibilities. Many writers viewed a human being as endowed with limitless aspiration towards an infinite good envisioned by the faculty of imagination. Our destiny, Wordsworth says in a visionary moment in the prelude, our being's heart and home is with infinitude and only there, and our desire is for something ever more about it, less than everything, Blake announced. cannot satisfy man. Humanity's undaunted aspiration beyond its assigned limits, which to the neoclassic moralists had been its tragic error of generic pride, now become humanity's glory and a mode of triumph even in failure or the pettiness of circumstances. In a parallel way, the typical neoclassical judgment that the highest art is the perfect achievement of limited aims gave way to dissatisfaction with rules and inherited restriction. According to number of romantic writers, the highest art consists in an endeavor beyond finite human possibility. As a result, neoclassical satisfaction in a perfectly accomplished because limited enterprise was replaced in writers such as Blake, Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Shelley by a preference for the glory of the imperfect, in which the artist's very failure attests the grandeur of his aim. Also, romantic writers once more entered into competition with their greatest predecessors in Odysseus' long poems in the most exacting genres. Wordsworth's prelude, it was actually a spiritual autobiography of center theme of John Milton's Paradise Lost, Blake's visionary and prophetic epics, Shelley's Prometheus Unbound, okay, Keats' Miltonic epic Hyperion, and Byron's ironic aspects of contemporary European civilization, Don John. These were the actually that the impact of French Revolution, and they have written this kind of things. So, hey guys, I hope that you understood the Romanticism. If you have any kind of queries, please ask in comment section. I will answer to your queries. So thank you for watching, and we will see in the